Why the Greg Biffle crash didn't start on approach. When we look at aviation accidents, there's a natural tendency to focus on the final moments, the last 30 seconds, the final approach, the impact sequence. That's where the dramatic conclusion happens, where the story ends. But that's often not where the accident actually began. The NTSB's second briefing gave us important information about where the citation was positioned and how it was configured in those final moments before impact. But what it doesn't explain, what it leaves unanswered, is why the crew's plan seemed to be constantly evolving, constantly changing in the first few minutes after takeoff. An understanding that matters tremendously, because the real anomaly in this accident, the real departure from normal, isn't what happened on final approach. It's what happened before the airplane ever committed to landing, before they were anywhere near the runway. If this had been a straightforward engine failure followed by a routine emergency return, we would expect to see a specific pattern in the data. One clean climb after takeoff. One deliberate turn back toward the airport. One stabilized setup for the approach. That's the textbook sequence, the pattern we see in successful emergency returns. That's not what the data shows here. Instead, what we see is a flight that never quite settles, that never quite finds its rhythm. So before we talk about outcomes, before we analyze the final approach or the impact sequence, we need to talk about process, about what was happening in that cockpit from very early on. Because aviation accidents, contrary to popular belief, don't always begin at the moment of impact. They don't always begin on final approach. They often begin much earlier, when a flight never finds its rhythm after an abnormal event, when the crew never gets ahead of the airplane. Let's break this down carefully. When accident investigators look at early ADSB tracking data, when they're doing preliminary analysis before they have the full flight data recorder information, they're not just looking for simple altitude loss. They're not just measuring whether the aircraft went up or down. They're looking for patterns, for signatures, for clues about what was happening operationally. And one pattern stands out clearly in the available tracking data from this flight, something that tells us a lot about what might have been happening in that cockpit. A repeated series of climbs and descents, not a single continuous descent back toward the airport, not a clean climb out followed by a level turn and then a controlled descent on approach, but a profile that looks uneven, almost oscillating in altitude. Almost like the airplane is searching for a stable state, trying to find an equilibrium and not quite achieving it. Now, it would be easy, it would be tempting to look at this data and simply describe it as descending, as the aircraft coming down to return to the airport. But that description misses the point entirely, misses what's actually significant here. What matters isn't the net change in altitude over the course of several minutes. What matters is the interruption of stabilization, the apparent inability to establish and maintain a steady state. In a normal departure, even in a departure where something goes wrong, even with an engine failure or another serious malfunction, there's usually a moment where things settle down, where equilibrium is reached. Power is set to a specific value and left there. Pitch attitude is established at a specific angle and maintained. Trim is adjusted to relieve control pressures. The airplane finds a steady rhythm, a stable configuration. And that rhythm, that period of stability, gives the crew something absolutely critical. It gives them space to think, space to plan, space to run checklists methodically, space to make informed decisions rather than reactive decisions. Here, in this accident, that rhythm appears to have been elusive. Multiple climb and descent transitions visible in the tracking data suggest that the crew may have been repeatedly retrimming the airplane, changing configuration, adjusting thrust settings, or responding to aircraft behavior or performance that wasn't matching their expectations or their mental model of what should be happening. None of that, and this is important to understand, none of that necessarily implies loss of control. The airplane wasn't departing from controlled flight. There's no evidence of a stall or a spin or any kind of uncontrolled flight, but what it does imply, what it strongly suggests, is work, continuous work. It implies the crew was actively managing something, some aspect of the aircraft's behavior that kept demanding attention, that wouldn't settle down and allow them to establish a stable platform from which to operate. This is where it helps to introduce a concept that doesn't get discussed much outside of professional pilot circles, outside of accident investigation seminars, and advanced crew resource management training, what we might call procedural turbulence. Now, procedural turbulence isn't atmospheric turbulence. It's not weather. It's not rough air physically bouncing the airplane around. It's task turbulence. It's cognitive turbulence. It happens when abnormal indications, when ambiguous cues, when unclear performance characteristics, when unexpected aircraft behavior prevents a crew from ever reaching a clean, steady, stable operating state. Instead of moving smoothly from one stable phase of flight to the next, the normal progression of takeoff to climb, climb to cruise, cruise to descent, the crew stays stuck in transition. They never complete one phase and move cleanly into the next. They're constantly in between states, constantly adjusting, constantly reacting to something. Transitions, by their very nature, are high workload. They involve multiple simultaneous tasks, configuration changes, power changes, cross-checks between instruments, call-outs between crew members, verification of systems and parameters, monitoring for expected responses to control inputs. All of this is manageable, all of this is routine. When transitions are brief, when they last 30 seconds or maybe a minute and then resolve into something stable, into a new steady state, they become dangerous. They become a significant risk factor when they never end, when the transition state persists for minutes without ever resolving into stability. And that's the key insight here, the thing that's easy to miss if you're just looking at numbers on a screen at altitude and airspeed values. Accidents don't always start with something dramatic and obvious. Sometimes they start with something subtle, a failure to ever regain normal rhythm after an abnormal event, a failure to ever establish that stable platform. When the airplane never quite settles into a steady state, neither does the crew's workload. Every second remains busy. Every moment demands active attention and management, even if nothing overtly dramatic is happening, even if there's no emergency warning blaring, no master caution flashing, there's no catastrophic system failure cascading through the aircraft, there's no structural damage spreading, there's just constant small adjustments, constant small corrections, constant reevaluation of what the airplane is doing versus what it should be doing, what was expected versus what's actually happening. And all of this matters. All of this is significant because the crew is burning margin the entire time. Not altitude margin necessarily, at least not yet. Not airspeed margin, but cognitive margin, attention margin, mental capacity margin, the psychological reserves, the mental bandwidth that you need to handle the next problem when it arises, to make the next decision with full consideration, to catch the next error before it becomes consequential. Those reserves are being depleted continuously without being replenished by a stable phase of flight, by a period where the workload drops and the crew can catch their breath. And all of this is the critical part, all of this procedural turbulence is happening before the airplane ever commits to a landing approach, before they're on final, before they're configured for landing, before any of the things we traditionally think of as the critical, high-risk phase of an emergency return. So when we later see what might appear to be a rushed setup, or compressed decision-making, or configuration choices that seem questionable in hindsight, it's worth remembering, it's essential to understand that the crew may have already been operating at elevated workload at reduced cognitive capacity for several minutes before that point, without the relief, without the recovery period, of a stable flight phase in between. This section of our analysis isn't about being low on approach. It isn't about the final moments. It's about something that came much earlier, something more subtle and harder to see. A climb profile, a departure sequence that never fully resolved into something steady, something stable, something that would give the crew the breathing room they needed to get organized and get ahead of the situation. If you're finding this kind of in-depth analysis valuable, if you want to understand not just what happened in aviation accidents, but why they happened, the human factors and the decision chains that led to the outcome, please take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel. We don't do surface-level coverage here. We go deep into the factors that matter, the cognitive traps, the system interactions, the decision points that turn manageable situations into tragedies. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. Your support helps us continue doing this kind of detailed analysis. Now, let's talk about planning, but not in the traditional sense of runway selection or approach geometry or wind calculations. Instead, let's talk about how many different plans were apparently in play, how many times the intended course of action changed. Early in the return sequence, based on the flight track data that's publicly available, the airplane appears to be aligned toward one particular runway, apparently setting up for an approach in one specific direction. Later, that plan appears to be abandoned. The aircraft changes heading significantly. Then, the aircraft re-enters a different pattern, apparently now setting up for a completely different runway, a different approach path, possibly even the opposite direction. Now, those facts by themselves, in isolation, don't necessarily imply error or poor decision-making. Crews change plans all the time, and often for very good reasons. Weather conditions change, wind direction shifts. New information becomes available about aircraft systems or performance. ATC, if you're in contact with them, might give you different instructions or suggestions. Equipment considerations come into play. Changing your plan is normal. It's often the right thing to do. Flexibility is important. The issue here, what raises questions, isn't that the plan changed. It's how often the plan apparently changed and under what conditions those changes were being made. From a cognitive psychology standpoint, from a human factors perspective, what this pattern suggests is that the crew wasn't executing a single, well-defined, briefed emergency return plan. They were replanning on the fly. They were making it up as they went. They were developing and revising their plan while the airplane was moving, while other tasks were demanding attention, while they were still trying to stabilize the aircraft and understand what was wrong with it. And every time a plan changes, even a small change, even what seems like a minor adjustment, new questions cascade into the cockpit. New decisions demand attention. Do we keep the current configuration, or do we need to change it for the new plan? Do we continue this turn, or do we need to widen it or tighten it to accommodate a different approach path? Do we need to rebrief the approach, to verbalize the new plan so both crew members are on the same page? Do crew roles need to change? Does someone need to take the radios now who wasn't handling them before? Does someone need to shift their focus exclusively to monitoring performance parameters or systems? Should we be looking at the checklist now or later? These questions don't arrive one at a time, politely waiting in queue for answers. They come in clusters. They arrive simultaneously, competing for attention. And they often arrive while the airplane is already in motion, already configured for the previous plan, already committed to a turn or a descent profile that may no longer make sense. This is why decision churn matters as a risk factor, why it's something investigators look for even though it doesn't show up as a line item on a checklist. Each plan change, each revision to the intended course of action, adds new configuration decisions to the workload. Do we need flaps now, or can we delay them? Should the gear go down now, or should we wait? It adds timing pressure because the airplane, unlike a meeting or a planning session, doesn't pause while you rethink your approach. The airplane keeps flying. It keeps moving through space. It keeps getting closer to the terrain, closer to the ground. And plan changes add coordination demands, communication requirements, because both people in the cockpit, assuming you have two effective crew members, which we don't yet know for certain in this case, both people need to be aligned on what the new plan actually is. They need shared mental models of where they're going, how they're getting there, what configuration they'll use, what speeds they'll maintain, what the decision points are. What's important to understand here, what's critical to absorbing this lesson, is that this analysis isn't about runway geometry. It's not about whether an opposite direction landing is inherently safe or unsafe. It's not about whether turning left versus right is better from an aircraft performance standpoint. This is about decision fragmentation, about how cognitive load gets distributed and managed when plans are unstable. When a crew has one clear, stable plan, even if that plan is demanding, even if it's a complex approach in difficult conditions, workload can be effectively shared and prioritized between crew members. Each person knows their role. Tasks can be divided logically, checklists can be executed in the proper sequence, there's structure, but when the plan keeps evolving, when it's changing every 30 seconds or every minute, workload multiplies in ways that aren't linear, that aren't proportional to the number of tasks. Tasks start to overlap in time. Some items get deferred because there's no bandwidth available right now. We'll get to it in a minute. Others get rushed because they should have been completed already under the previous plan, but weren't because the plan changed. Dependencies between tasks become unclear. What has to happen before what? What's critical right now versus what can wait? These are the kinds of questions that have clear answers when you're executing a stable plan, but become murky when you're constantly revising. And here's the subtle part. the thing that's easy to miss from outside the cockpit, from the comfortable position of a post-accident analysis with unlimited time to think. This cognitive overload, this decision fragmentation, can happen even if everyone involved is calm, is professional, is well-trained, is well-intentioned. Planned churn increases workload faster than any single task or checklist item ever could, not because checklists are poorly designed or procedures are inadequate, but because replanning, especially continuous replanning under time pressure, consumes the very resource that checklists and procedures are designed to protect. Attention, cognitive bandwidth, mental capacity, working memory. When you're constantly making new high-level decisions about what the plan is, about where you're going and how you're getting there, you have less mental capacity remaining to execute any particular plan well, to fly it precisely, to monitor it carefully. By the time the airplane is finally lined up for what turned out to be its final approach attempt, for whatever runway and whatever direction they ultimately committed to, the crew may already have been mentally behind the airplane, not because they panicked, not because they lacked skill or training or experience, but because they had been managing change after change after change, revision after revision, without ever getting a pause to consolidate their thoughts, to get organized, to get ahead of the situation. That's why this aspect of the accident sequence matters so much for understanding what happened, not because any single plan they considered was necessarily the wrong choice, not because the decision to turn back was inherently flawed, but because the act of repeatedly changing plans, of continuous replanning under pressure, may have quietly, invisibly, narrowed the crew's cognitive margin, reduced their capacity to handle additional challenges, long before those final moments, long before the final approach, long before anything looked obviously wrong to an outside observer. There's a phase of flight during abnormal operations during emergencies that rarely shows up clearly in data plots, in ADS-B tracks, in rather reconstructions. And it often doesn't sound particularly dramatic on cockpit voice recordings either if you're just listening casually. There's usually no shouting, no alarms blaring continuously, no obvious moment of crisis. It's the gap, the space, between recognizing that something isn't right and figuring out what that something actually is. The interval between knowing you have a problem and knowing what problem you have, what it means, what it implies. In this accident, that gap, that period of uncertainty, likely occurred very early in the sequence, shortly after liftoff, but before any stabilized return pattern existed, before any clear plan had been formed and briefed and agreed upon. And it's a critically important phase to understand because it's often where well-intentioned decisions, choices that seem reasonable in the moment, begin to narrow options and reduce flexibility instead of preserving or expanding them. After takeoff, especially after something abnormal happens, crews don't always get a clear, unambiguous warning message that tells them exactly what the problem is, what failed, what the implications are. Modern aircraft have sophisticated warning and alerting systems, layers of automation designed to diagnose problems. But those systems aren't perfect. They can't always immediately and accurately diagnose complex failure modes, unusual combinations of problems, or situations that fall outside their programmed logic. More often, what crews get in those first moments are partial clues, incomplete information, a vibration that doesn't match anything in their previous experience or training, performance that feels slightly off, subtly wrong in a way that's hard to articulate, control pressures that don't quite line up with what the pilot expects based on current configuration and power settings. Maybe an instrument parameter that's technically still within normal limits, technically still in the green arc, but trending the wrong direction, moving toward a limit faster than it should. Maybe multiple small anomalies that don't seem connected, but collectively suggest something isn't normal. None of those clues by themselves, in isolation, necessarily demands an immediate specific response. A slight vibration might be transient, might go away. Marginally reduced performance might be acceptable, might not be safety critical. An instrument trend might stabilize on its own. And that ambiguity, that uncertainty, is exactly what makes this phase so cognitively demanding, so mentally difficult to manage well. There's not enough clear information to know for certain what's wrong to make a definitive diagnosis, but there's enough information, enough cues to know that something has changed, that something is different from normal, that the situation bears watching. Investigators, this is standard procedure in any accident investigation, We'll carefully examine whether the crew in this case was dealing with ambiguous information in those critical early moments. Signals and indications that something had changed, that something had degraded or failed, but without immediate clarity on exactly what component or system had failed, how serious the failure was, whether it was getting worse, what secondary effects might develop. In that environment of uncertainty, in that fog of incomplete information, crews very often feel pressure, both self-imposed internal pressure and sometimes external pressure, to do something, to take action, to make a decision before they fully understand what they're dealing with, before the diagnosis is complete. The instinct, the psychological drive, is to act, to demonstrate command of the situation, to not appear paralyzed or indecisive. And returning to the airport, initiating a return to land, very often feels like a safe, conservative, prudent move. It feels reversible, like you're not burning any bridges, like you're not committing to anything irreversible. It feels like you're reducing risk by getting the airplane back on the ground at a familiar airport with a known runway, with emergency equipment presumably available. Get it on the ground. Sort it out on the ground where there's no time pressure. But in practice, in the actual execution, in the reality of how this plays out in a cockpit, initiating a return to the airport can commit the flight to a high workload path, a demanding sequence of tasks, before some critical foundational things have been established. Before crew roles have been clearly defined and verbalized, before it's explicitly clear who's flying the airplane and who's managing systems and running checklists. Before available automation, if the aircraft has it and if it's appropriate to use in this situation, has been engaged and configured to help reduce manual workload. Before the crew has had even a brief opportunity to step back mentally and ask the fundamental diagnostic question, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? What exactly is wrong with this airplane, and what does that failure imply for how we should proceed? What limitations we now have, what capabilities we've lost? Once that return path is chosen, once the decision is made and the turn back toward the airport is initiated, the airplane doesn't wait for you to catch up. It keeps moving. Tasks start accumulating immediately. Turns have to be flown, headings have to be selected and maintained. Configurations have to be considered and decisions made about when to change them. Radios still need monitoring. Even if you're not in contact with ATC, there are other aircraft to be aware of, frequencies to guard, and all of this activity, all of these tasks, happen while the crew is still sorting out, still trying to understand what's actually normal and what isn't in the current degraded state of the aircraft. What instruments and indications can be trusted? What performance should we expect? What limitations apply now that didn't apply 5 minutes ago? What can this airplane still do and what can't it do anymore? The key point here, and this builds on our earlier discussion but approaches it from a different angle, is not about urgency, not about rushing. We've already explored the dangers of feeling rushed. This is about timing and sequence, about the order in which things happen. Early action, action taken before diagnosis is reasonably complete, before you understand what you're dealing with, can lock a crew into a sequence of required tasks, into a chain of necessary actions that leaves very little room to slow things down later, very little opportunity to pause and reconsider whether this is really the best path. And if that action, that commitment to return, happens before crew responsibilities have been clearly divided and verbalized, or before automation has been properly configured to reduce workload, or before the crew has had any chance to brief even a basic plan of what they're going to do, task saturation can develop quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, without any single obvious moment of overload. There's no dramatic spike in workload that you can point to. It just builds gradually and never comes back down. From the outside, to an observer watching the flight track or listening to radio communications, it can look like a prompt, professional, appropriate response. Crew recognizes an abnormal situation, makes a decision to return, initiates maneuvering back to the airport. Textbook emergency handling. But from the inside, from the lived experience of the people in that cockpit managing that situation in real time, it can feel very different. It can feel like trying to build a plan while simultaneously executing it, like trying to organize your thoughts and develop a strategy while also managing a moving, changing, demanding aircraft that requires constant attention, like trying to think and do at the same time when you really need to think first and then do. That's why this gap, this phase between initial problem recognition and complete problem understanding, matters so much in accident analysis. Not because it proves anything definitive at this stage of the investigation, not because we can draw final conclusions without more data, but because it's so often in so many accidents across different aircraft types and different scenarios, where options begin to narrow, where flexibility begins to decrease, where margins begin to erode, long before anyone in the cockpit fully realizes how constrained and limited the situation has become. Now, let's talk about configuration, but not simply as preparation for landing, not as a procedural checklist item. Instead, let's talk about configuration as commitment, as an energy decision, as a choice that has aerodynamic and performance consequences that aren't always immediately obvious or intuitive. In aviation training, especially in initial training, configuration changes are often presented and treated as neutral procedural steps. Landing gear down is a step on the approach checklist. Flaps to approach setting is a step. Flaps to landing setting is a step. They're part of the normal flow, part of what you do on every approach to every runway. Check the box, move to the next item. But in jets, particularly in aircraft with relatively high wing loading and specific aerodynamic characteristics, configuration changes are not passive or neutral. They're not just procedural boxes to check. They actively and significantly reshape the airplane's energy state, its capability to accelerate or climb or arrest a descent rate in ways that aren't always intuitive or obvious, especially under abnormal conditions, especially when something else is already degraded. Early deployment of landing gear or extension of flaps increases drag substantially. That's expected. That's understood. That's the entire aerodynamic purpose: to create drag, to slow the airplane, and to create additional lift at lower speeds. What's less intuitive, what often isn't fully appreciated until you're actually in the situation experiencing it, is how quickly and how dramatically that added drag can reduce climb authority, can reduce glide performance, can limit your options, especially if the airplane is already dealing with some kind of abnormal performance condition, reduced thrust from a failed engine or degraded systems, or if thrust margins are thinner than usual due to weight or density, altitude, or temperature conditions. Investigators, this is absolutely standard in any accident investigation involving an approach, will carefully explore whether configuration changes in this accident occurred at a point in the flight where the airplane still needed maximum flexibility, still needed to preserve the option to climb away, to accelerate, to execute a go-around if the approach didn't work out. This line of questioning isn't about accusing the crew of a specific procedural error, of what pilots sometimes call dirtying up the airplane too early. It's about understanding and reconstructing the decision chain, about figuring out how each configuration choice may have incrementally, quietly reduced the envelope of possible actions, removed options from the table. Once landing gear is fully extended and flaps are deployed to landing configuration, the airplane becomes more honest in a certain sense. It will do exactly what physics and aerodynamics allow based on its current energy state, based on available thrust and current airspeed, and it will do no more than that. If additional thrust or additional pitch input doesn't produce the expected response, doesn't arrest the descent rate, or doesn't increase climb performance, there may be no configuration left to reverse, no way to clean up the airplane and reduce drag without having significant altitude available to manage the transition safely. And if you're already low, already close to terrain, already in the final phase of an approach, that altitude simply may not be available. This is where an important and subtle distinction needs to be understood, one that's very easy to overlook if you're not thinking carefully about energy management. A jet can be perfectly aligned with the runway centerline, tracking perfectly. It can be perfectly under control in the traditional sense: wings level, ball centered, nose pointed exactly where it should be pointed. It can even feel stable and normal to the crew, not obviously divergent, not showing any clear signs of being out of control, and yet still be unable to arrest or reduce its descent rate once it's been fully configured for landing, once all that drag has been added and energy has been bled off. That situation, that energy deficit, doesn't require a dramatic catastrophic failure. It doesn't require loss of control in the traditional sense of a stall or a spin or unusual attitudes. It only requires an energy state, a combination of altitude and airspeed and descent rate, that has already been committed by